Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is the 1890s Cleveland Spiders Epilogue. During the 1890s, the Cleveland Spiders were a tremendous team. They played in 3 championship series. They won a championship in 1895, and they were one of the best teams in baseball. And then after the 1899 season, they ceased to operate. So I thought we'd take one last look at the Cleveland Spiders and what happened to the players after 1899. Of course, the greatest Spider of all was Siyoung, and he had been transferred to St. Louis in 1900 with the best Spiders players, played for the Perfectos. He was unhappy in St. Louis and signed with Boston in the New American League in 1901. In 1903, the first modern World Series, Siyoung won 3 games and helped Boston defeat Pittsburgh in the World Series, win a title there. Years later, he returned to Cleveland, played for the Cleveland Naps at the end of his career, named after Napoleon Lajoie. He died in 1955 at age 88. Visitors to the village of Newcomerstown, Ohio, during the late 1940s and early 1950s, they might see an elderly man in overalls and a straw hat sitting in a chair, smoking a pipe, and chatting with the local people at the local gas station. After his death, the Cy Young Award was established for the best pitcher in Major League Baseball, and then initially it was just one for both leagues, and then it was decided to have one for each league. I believe last year Corey Kluber of Cleveland won the Cy Young Award. Cy Young, what a guy. Jesse the Crab Burkett lived a long life after baseball. His career as a player ended in 1905, and he played and managed minor league teams for a decade more. He coached for his old enemy, John McGraw, on the New York Giants. In the managers, he managed to, in the minors, he was a manager and he pinch hit. And one day, he was managing in the minor leagues and he went up to pinch hit, and the umpire said, "Who are you batting for?" And then Burkett responded, "None of your blankety-blank business." And the umpire turned to the crowd and said, "Burkett batting for exercise." Jesse Burkett made the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1946, and he said this, quote, "It took them a long time. I thought they weren't going to because everybody had forgotten me." When he was 77 years old, he was bedridden. A few years later, the Worcester, Massachusetts, which is where his hometown, they organized the Jesse Burkett Little League. And Jesse Burkett cried, and when he was told, he said this, quote, "I am not forgotten after all, thanks to fellows like you." So that was very touching at the end of his life. He died of a heart attack in 1953 at age 84. Jesse the Crab Burkett. Bobby Wallace also made it to the Hall of Fame. In 1902, he jumped to the St. Louis Browns in the American League. He was the premier shortstop in the American League. And it was only 1918 until he finally retired at age 45. He was the last Cleveland Spider to play in the MLB. He managed for Cincinnati in 1937, and he was a coach and scout until his death in 1960. Bobby Wallace. Chief Zimmer was released by the Spiders in June of 1899, but he played a few more seasons. One year he was a National League umpire. After he retired, he had a number of business interests, including a bowling alley, a cigar factory, billiards hall, and real estate. And he came back for a 1921 Old Timers game at League Park in Cleveland, which was a 2-inning game, and he caught Cy Young for one last time. A newspaper account said this, quote, "A quarter of a century seemed to make no difference. They worked together as if they had been playing continuously until now." In 1932, Chief Zimmer was 71 years old, and he said this, quote, "Not a thing wrong with me. I work in my garden every day, stay up as late as I like, eat what I like, and run around like a youngster." Chief Zimmer remained close friends with Cy Young, his old battery mate, till his death in 1949 at age 89. Good guy, Chief Zimmer, my my favorite Cleveland Spider. Louis Alexis. He played after his MLB career. He played well in the Waterbury in the Connecticut State League in the minor leagues in the rest of 1899. In the spring of 1900, he was nowhere to be found, and he spent a couple years as a homeless vagrant, occasionally being arrested for drunkenness. In 1902, he hit .288 for Lowell in the New England League. Age 31, his baseball career was over, and he went home to the Penobscot Indian tribe in Maine, and he worked as a logger. He also piloted a ferry to Indian Island Reservation, from there to the mainland and back. He was an avid reader of newspapers, which passengers left behind, especially the sporting news, so he kept up with Major League Baseball. He was working for a logging crew deep in the Maine woods on Christmas Eve in 1913 when he died of a heart attack at age 42. He had played in the minors for Hartford, Connecticut, and Lowell, Massachusetts. In 1900, he'd been living on the streets, begging for money to buy a cheap half pint of alcohol. In the Providence, Rhode Island newspaper wrote this, quote, "Curveball are not the sort of benders that have kept the red man down." In August of 1900, he'd been sentenced to 1 month in the House of Corrections for vagrancy, so a month in prison. A month after his release, he was arrested in Pittsburgh for vagrancy. And at that time, he had a severe case of delirium tremens, DTs, for alcoholism. One day in Portland, Maine, several boys were making fun of him. You know, he was very bedraggled looking, wearing his old clothes, and he wasn't clean. And a man intervened when he saw this happening, and he said to these boys, quote, "There isn't one of you fit to carry this fellow's shoes. You're looking at the greatest ball player who ever lived." And it was Jesse the Crab Burkett, his old teammate on the Spiders, who intervened. And Burkett was the manager for the Worcester College town. He put his arm around Alexis' shoulders and walked his old friend down Congress Street in Providence, Rhode Island. Alexis returned to Indian Island, where he found some peace. And he was an umpire in Maine. And it was written, quote, "He soon won the confidence of the batteries for his unerring judgment on balls and strikes. He was on top of every play. He insisted on big league discipline of the players." He also taught Penobscot Indian children about baseball, and 5 of them became professionals in the New England League. And one of them said this, quote, "Sock taught us to get on base and not to worry about the extra base hit. He showed us all the tricks of working a walk from the pitcher. We were proud to play for him." Louis Alexis. Ed McKean, star shortstop on the Spiders. In June of 1899, he was playing for the St. Louis Perfectos and struggling and ended up being benched. He was being overweight hastened his exit from the MLB. And his MLB career was ended in July of 1899. He ran a tavern in Cleveland called the Shortstop Saloon. In 1902, he was the player manager for Rochester in the Eastern League for half a year. He played in the minor leagues until 1908 at age 44. He worked as a whiskey distributor, a bartender, and he was a heavy drinker. He died of gastric ulcers in 1919 at age 55. On October 28, 1899, McKean was an umpire at an amateur game at Scenic Park in the Rocky River Valley in Rocky River, Ohio, just down in the Metro Parks here in Cleveland, just down the hill. What's now a big grassy picnic area. And that there were 4,800 fans came to that game, which really shows that Cleveland would support baseball. In 1900, Ed McKean hoped to play for the American League Cleveland Lakeshores, but he was not offered a contract. In 1902, he was manager of the Rochester Broncos in the Eastern League. Resigned in August with a 44-53 record. He had hit .314 as player manager. In 1903, he was playing for the Elks Club in Elyria, Ohio. In 1904, for the Canton Marines semi-pro team. In 1905, for Colorado Springs in the Western League. He was in the minor leagues from age 33 to 39, played for 10 teams. Between 1905 and '06, he was on 5 teams, so he was really bouncing around in the minors. For Colorado Springs, he played for the Colorado Springs Millionaires. And Colorado Springs had 35 of the 100 wealthiest men in America because these guys had made their fortune from the Cripple Creek mines in Colorado. McKean won a title for Springfield, Ohio, in the Central League. In 1909, he came back for an old-timers game at League Park. In 1912, there was a big St. Patrick's Day parade for Johnny Kilbane in Cleveland, who had become the world featherweight boxing champion, and he was McKean's neighbor in Cleveland. In July of 1919, McKean had severe abdominal pain, especially after eating, and there was blood in his vomit. He died at home on August 16, 1919, of a gastric ulcer due to alcoholism. His funeral was the St. Patrick's Catholic Church on Bridge Avenue in Cleveland on August 19th, and he was buried in Calvary Cemetery. He left behind 4 children: Edward, who was 21, Robert, who was 20, Martin, who was 11, and Marie, who was 7, Ed McKean. Cupid Childs in 1900 was sold by St. Louis to Chicago and released in July of 1901. He retired at age 33. He hit .245 in the New York State League, and that was the end. He returned to Baltimore, where he owned a coal delivery business. Years of heavy drinking had damaged his kidneys, and in his early 40s, his health failed and he was bedridden. His business was tottering on bankruptcy. Cupid Childs died in 1912 at age 45 of Bright's disease, and his teammates chipped in to pay his medical bills. Cupid Childs. Jimmy McAllister was the manager for the Cleveland Lakeshores in the American League in 1900, what became the Cleveland Indians eventually. He was the manager of the St. Louis Browns and the Washington Senators as well. He developed Walter Johnson, the Senators. In 1912, he was part owner and president of the Boston Red Sox when they won the World Series at New Fenway Park. His hometown of Youngstown, Ohio, in that area, he managed real estate. In 1931, he was widowed and recently remarried, and losing a battle with cancer, and shot himself in the head and died at age 66. Jimmy McAllister. Jack O'Connor, they called Rowdy Jack, in 1909 was manager for the St. Louis Browns. Ty Cobb and Napoleon Lajoie were in a race for the batting title and the possibility of winning a Chalmers car. Lajoie, playing for Cleveland, was 8 for 9 in a doubleheader against the Browns, mostly bunt hits. O'Connor was the manager, had the third baseman playing in short left field to help Lajoie, which really wasn't fair to Cobb. For this antic, he was fired and banned from Major League Baseball. In 1913, he was a Federal League manager and broke an umpire's jaw with a punch and kicked out of that league. He was interviewed in 1937 by The Sporting Life, 4 years before his death, and he called baseball, quote, a game for sissies. Jack O'Connor, funny guy. Jack Powell became Jack O'Connor's brother-in-law and married his sister Nora in 1902. Now, the marriage broke up after 5 years, but he stayed friends with Jack O'Connor. He had a long career with the talent-poor St. Louis Browns, most of his years in the MLB. He won 245 games, lost 254. His one-loss record would have been better if he played on a better team. Powell retired in 1912, made a comeback in 1918 at age 44, and died in Chicago, Illinois, in 1944 at age 70. Jack Powell. John Clarkson quit the Spiders in a huff in 1894. Over the years, there were rumors of a comeback. He never pitched again. His mental health deteriorated. In 1905, his family had him confined in an asylum in Massachusetts, and he died at age 47. John Clarkson, tremendous player. Buck Ewing was manager of his hometown Cincinnati Reds for several seasons. He became wealthy from wise investments in real estate. He developed diabetes and kidney failure and died at age 45 of Bright disease in 1906. Buck Ewing, tremendous player. Harry Blake dropped out of the majors after a mediocre 1899 season with St. Louis. He died in a rooming house fire in Chicago in 1919 at age 45. Harry Blake. Jake Virtue, early in 1895, he was preparing for spring training with the Louisville Colonels. Had a stroke on his right side, which left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. And he died in 1943, 48 years later. The Sporting News reported those were very tough years that he spent as, quote, a helpless cripple. Jake Virtue. Chippy Megara was a National League umpire in 1899. He was not rehired for the 1900 season and became despondent and depressed. He wound up in the Worcester, Massachusetts home for the insane, his hometown. The last few years of his life were spent there, and his health failed. It was said that he had a, quote, general paralysis of the insane and exhaustion. And he died in 1904 at age 41. Most of these guys were heavy drinkers, which led to their early deaths. Very tragic. Nig Cuppy, in 1901, joined Cy Young, his Cleveland teammate. He joined him in Boston in the American League. Manager Jimmy Collins disliked his slow-working pace. And in practice, Collins stationed a teammate behind Cuppy on the mound. And if Cuppy did not pitch by a count of 8, that player was instructed to jab Cuppy with a hat pin. Terrible. He retired after that season, went into the tobacco business in Indiana, and died of Bright's disease in 1922 at age 53. Nig Cuppy. George Davis disappeared after a tremendous 20-year MLB career, which had mostly been spent in Chicago and New York. Nobody knew what happened to him. Lee Allen, a historian of the Baseball Hall of Fame, became obsessed with the whereabouts and what happened to George Davis, and he pursued many leads, many phone calls, and many letters over the years. And finally, in 1968, he learned that Davis had died in 1940 in Philadelphia, and he worked as a used car salesman there. George Davis, tremendous player. Bob Leadley, in 1899, disappeared with $10,000. He was a clerk at the Detroit Police Court. He fled to Mexico and was there for more than a decade. In the 1920s, the heat died down and he slipped back into the U.S., where the authorities did not discover him, and died in Los Angeles, California in 1936. Bob Leadley. Tommy Tucker was released for refusing to chase down a loose ball, which turned a rare 1899, what would have been an 1899 Cleveland Spiders victory, into a stunning loss. Historian David Nemi wrote that Tucker, quote, grew increasingly unpopular with each passing year, so that by the time he took his last throw at first base in a game, no one was sorry to see him go. Tucker had a few more years in the minors. Then he worked in the Holyoke, Massachusetts paper mills and died in 1935 at age 71. Tommy Tucker. Harry Cauliflower, his only victory as an MLB pitcher was in his debut, his first game, and spent the rest of the 1899 season trying to recapture the magic of that one good game. In 1910, Cauliflower was an American League umpire. He went into business in his native Washington, D.C., and was the next to last living Cleveland Spider, when he died in 1961 at age 92. Harry Cauliflower. Charlie Knepper had been 4-22 with the Spiders in 1899 as a pitcher. He failed several trials in the high minors and finally gave up, returned to Indiana, and became a heating technician in a gear factory, and died in 1946. Charlie Knepper. Creed Bates, or Frank Bates, disappeared. He worked as a laborer in his native Tennessee, and he filled out a draft card for the First World War in 1918. There's no record after that. He's one of the few MLB players where there is no date or place of... The date and place of death is a mystery. It's unknown. Creed Bates, or Frank Bates. Coldwater Jim Huey, 1900, was in St. Louis with Patsy Tabo and the Cardinals. He had a few more years in the minor leagues, returned to his hometown of Coldwater, Michigan. He and his wife operated a general store there until his death in 1945. His career record was 29-80, a winning percentage of .266, which is the lowest winning percentage of any pitcher with 100-plus decisions. He's the last pitcher to lose 30 games in a season and the only pitcher with 100-plus complete games without a shutout. Jim Huey. Lave Cross, as a third baseman, won 3 titles with Brooklyn in 1900 and the Philadelphia A's in 1902 and 1905. So that's wonderful. He was in the minor leagues for a few more years. He worked at an auto plant in Toledo, Ohio, and died in 1927. Lave Cross. Joe Quinn worked in his father-in-law's funeral home in St. Louis and died in 1940 at age 75. Joe Quinn. Eddie Kolb pitched his last game, pitched the last game in the history of the Cleveland Spiders. In 1899, he played and managed with some success in the lower minor leagues. He moved to Alberta, Canada. He had a prosperous restaurant for 2 decades, and then during the oil boom, he became successful in that business. Eddie Kolb, the cigar boy in Cincinnati, became E.W. Kolb, wealthy oil executive. He died in 1949, 50 years after his only MLB game. Eddie Kolb, he's the guy who kept asking if he could pitch for the Spiders, even though he wasn't on the team. And they finally said, okay, kid, you can pitch. Last game. Crazy Schmidt. In 1900, the National League adopted a 5-sided home plate, and it had been diamond-shaped before. And Crazy Schmidt remained as crazy as ever. He wrote a letter to the Sporting News claiming credit for the idea, and he wrote this quote, "I pitched some 14 exceptional games for Cleveland last summer." Now his record was 2-17. "I am like a gnarled oak, and am getting better every year. I was a drawing card in Chicago, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and drew in my salary at the gate many times over." He had a high opinion of himself. He got a tryout with John McGraw and the Orioles in 1901. However, he showed up drunk, fell off the mound, and was told to leave. In 1902, he was pitching semi-pro baseball in the Chicago City League and died in 1940. Crazy Schmidt. Frank Robeson, the Spiders owner, his dream to win a pennant in St. Louis did not happen. Many of the Cardinals players, that he had brought from Cleveland, well, the name was changed to the Cardinals after 1899 from the Perfectos. Many of those players jumped to the American League. In 1903, there was a fire from lightning at the stadium in St. Louis. In 1906, he ceded control to his brother Stanley and retired to his lakefront manor in Cleveland. And he died suddenly of a stroke in 1908 at age 56. Frank Robeson. His brother Stanley Robeson, who had been in charge of the Spiders in 1899, was a lifelong bachelor. He ran the St. Louis Cardinals till his death in 1911. And then his brother Frank's daughter became the new owner, Helene Robeson Britton, MLB's first female owner. And the Cardinals won their first title in 1926. Stanley Robeson. Now, what happened to Cleveland? They got a new team in the American League. They were first called the Lake Shores in 1900, the Blues in 1901, Broncos in 1902, and then the Naps in 1903 after the tremendous player Napoleon Lajoie. In 1908, they almost won a championship. In 1911, Sunday baseball was finally allowed in Cleveland. In 1915, the team was named the Indians, and they won World Series in 1920 and 1948, and won American League championships in 1954, 1995, 1997, and 2016. Cleveland, Ohio. Patsy Tabo played for the St. Louis Perfectos in 1899. He got in a shoving match with John McGraw of the Orioles. He was out of control. At the time, the St. Louis fans threw eggs and garbage at the Orioles. 1900, he was managing from the bench. He only played in one game and was hitless with 3 errors. Tabo had drawn his managerial energy from playing. His usual feistiness and spirit was gone when he became a bench manager. He was listless and uninterested and resigned on August 19th, 1900. And he wrote this quote, "I feel like a kid out of school. For the present, I don't know what my plans are." Tabo opened a tavern in his old neighborhood, Goose Hill in St. Louis. However, drinking and illness led to him becoming bitter in his final years. His wife, Kate, filed for divorce and moved back to Cleveland with the children from St. Louis. This was a blow that Patsy Tabo did not recover from. And on May 23rd, 1918, he shot himself with a handgun in the head in his tavern at age 53. He was brought back to Cleveland and buried in Cleveland, Ohio. Patsy Tabo. And finally, Sport McAllister was the last living Cleveland Spider when he died in 1962 at age 87. So that's the story of the 1890s Cleveland Spiders. They were a memorable team. Brought a lot of glory to the city of Cleveland, a lot of tragedy, a lot of entertainment, really interesting fellows. God bless the fellows who played for the Cleveland Spiders in the 1890s, especially, including the fans, especially the Civil War veterans, captains of the Cuyahoga, lovers of Lake Erie, Terminal Tower Power, fans of the Free Stamp Statue and the Fountain of Eternal Life, Euclid Avenue Electricity, First Energy Stadium friends, Progressive Field pals, Quicken Loans Arena enthusiasts, Severance Hall stalwarts, Tribe, Browns, Cavs, Monsters, and Gladiators rule Cleveland, City of Champions. It's been 70 years since 1948. This is our year. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really, really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.